a good example is the idea of a politician doing public prayer. You would never see that in the early republic. The most theocratic New Englander, if they were a representative, member of the state house, governor, whatever, they would have never prayed in public. And now we have some cabinet officers who do it. And so that's a good example. Would some of those guys code in the early republic code as Christian nationalism because of what they think the government should do vis-a-vis Christianity? Sure. But they themselves would not have done what you might think of as churchy things, gospel presentations, praying. I think we've kind of seen, at least in the last 20 years, especially on the right, there's more a sense of, we want the president to say something particularly Christian-y, or we want, whoever to say something kind of Christian-y.
We don't want to live in the village green at the end of the day. We can all leave and return to our houses of worship, but our goal is to encourage conversational theology in the village green, where we can rub shoulders with Christians from different traditions and expressions.
Since the United States is celebrating its 250th anniversary, we thought that we would dive a little more deeply into the history of the Christian faith in America, especially focusing on the early republic. And to do this, we're going to have two conversations with two distinct professors of history at Hillsdale College. Dr. Miles Smith is the author of Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War, and also of the upcoming book, Valiant and Pious, The Idea of a Christian Soldier in America, 1800 to 1861. And Dr. Darryl Hart, longtime friend, has written many books. You might know him as a specialist on J. Gresham Machen, but he's also written Ben Franklin, Cultural Protestant, for Oxford University Press, and also The Lost Soul of American Protestantism. Most recently, Protestants and Patriots, Presbyterians in the Age of Revolution. So first of all, I was struck by a quote, Miles, in your preface of your book. There are, from Lord Macaulay, English historian, there are two opposite errors into which those who study the annals of our country are in constant danger of falling: the error of judging the present by the past, and the error of judging the past by the present. The former is the error of minds prone to reverence whatever is old, the latter of minds readily attracted by whatever is new. The former error may perpetually be observed in the reasonings of conservative politicians on the questions of their own day. The latter error perpetually infects the speculations of writers of the liberal school when they discuss the transactions of an earlier age. The former error is the more pernicious in a statesman, and the latter in a historian. I want to ask you, Miles, first of all, as a historian, give us a little bit of advice on how we should approach the question of Christianity in America. It's such a fraught topic with a lot of misunderstanding on both sides of the ideological aisle. And you really see the twin dangers there that Macaulay's referring to. Can you unpack that a little bit and why it's important for us to think historically, recognizing the past is the past, and it's not necessarily an eternal idea?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think that one of the things I kind of realized as I got more and more into my profession was sort of asking the question if there's a difference between the study of Christianity and the study of the church properly, the church as an institution. And I think I'm probably more willing to draw a black line between the two in this way. I'm here in North Carolina on vacation, and I'm from Western North Carolina, which is historically a very Presbyterian place, for example. But the church itself, there weren't a lot of churches. And so you had a lot of people who were doing what they perceived to be religious lives without a lot of ecclesiastical oversight or even a lot of just institutional affiliation. And so I think that the study of Christianity and the study of the church itself aren't always synonyms. And I think that this is one of the things that I think that just sort of separating those two out means that especially if you study religion, that your philosophy of history has to change a little bit. I mean, the 20th century was a clerical century. I mean, the church was big and active and influential in the 20th century. And I think this is maybe where some conservative evangelicals miss just how influential the main line was. There's sort of this idea that everything was secular and, this sort of we've been under attack forever. Well, actually, the church was kind of in high heels for much of the 20th century. And so I think that in that regard, there's, at least historically, think about the 19th century, which is mainly where I study, separating out the church and Christianity, having some sort of taxonomical separation is important. And so because we live downstream from the 20th century, which was the more clericalist century than the 19th, I think that we tend to sort of make assumptions about what church life was like during the early republic, during the time of the Revolution. For example, I think we have this idea that everybody was in churches and their pastor got up and said, "We hate Britain," and they took up rifles and as a church went out and fought the Brits or whatever. And that's anachronistic. I mean, especially in frontier populations, they weren't in churches all that often. It might have been the case in New England. But I think those are just a few observations I think of as sort of thinking more seriously about the nuance of especially religious history in the U.S.
In fact, you talk about the importance of distinguishing not only church and state, but church and religion in the early republic. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so think about the sort of the frontier family we have as an idea. They have maybe the King James Bible, if they were Anglican, maybe a prayer book. If they're Reformed, maybe a Geneva Bible or something like that. And so they have the Bible in their homes, and I was surprised even that wasn't as common as I thought. But nonetheless, these people perceive themselves to be living religious lives. Is family worship church, for example? A lot of these people would have done something like family worship. Well, why? Because there was only an ordained minister around every 6 weeks or so. And so what does it mean to live a religious life without regular exposure to, sort of regularly ordered, ecclesiastical worship? And so I think I'm hesitant to anathematize this kind of religious life and say, well, it's not Christian. And I understand the impulse to say, well, if it's not the church, it's probably not Christian. But on some level, these people are Christian people. And I think we have to sort of ask ourselves, what does it look like to live a religious life when you don't have the regular exposure to the institutional life of the church? What does that mean? And so I think at least in the early republic, we have to separate those out a little bit.
Can an analogy be drawn to the Middle Ages when the Fourth Lateran Council had to require people to go to Mass and make confession once a year? Society was kind of assumed it was Christian. You weren't anything else, the festivals and all that. But as far as institutional belonging, it was more something less pervasive, perhaps.
Yeah, Rodney Stark actually makes that comparison. I think it's in the second volume of his books. I think it's The Triumph of Christianity. He points out that, the Middle Ages, most people didn't go to church. We have, especially, on the intellectual right, there's this kind of Christianization of the medieval era that's gone on. We have this idea that everybody was in church and going to these big cathedrals, and that's just not the case. And sort of similar, I think there's an idea that everybody in the 19th century had very Christian families and very church families. No, church was something people actually had to be sort of reminded to go do. And church was something that wasn't necessarily a norm. Even people who assumed they were Christians weren't always churchy people. And so, yeah, that analogy is very apt.
In the introduction of your book, Religion and Republic, you write, 70 years of jurisprudence from the Supreme Court and more recent battles over questions of theocracy or so-called Christian nationalism have convinced a significant number of American evangelicals that any state involvement with Christianity is both un-American or an invasion of supposedly pure religious practice. In conservative Calvinist circles, this has been particularly pronounced with breathless denunciations of theocracy, or liberalism being thrown about by partisans of a secularist spirituality of the church and devotees of robust public Christianity, respectively. The United States religious order was from the beginning neither theocratic nor secular. How was the United States religious order neither theocratic nor secular?
I think it was, there's the terms of religion. Think about this. The United States, from the get-go, has a sort of a social apparatus of Christianity that across the board was relatively observant of, say, state-initiated fast days or state-initiated Thanksgiving. The holiday of Thanksgiving was designed to be celebrated in churches. So there would be a day of Thanksgiving. And so they would go to churches. Now, there's a good question is a day of Thanksgiving, is a Thanksgiving service a church service? Maybe that's where someone might want to nitpick, and that would be fair. But I think that in as much as if it's a clergyman leading it, and if it's largely his congregations that's gathering for Thanksgiving, has that annihilated the churchiness of the church, that it was a magisterial proclamation that initiated it? And obviously, I think the question of chaplains becomes important too. I have a friend who is a Wisconsin Synod Lutheran. The Wisconsin Synod does not have chaplains because they're absolutely committed to, I think, what we might think of in Reformed terms as the spirituality of the church, and they take that very seriously. On the other hand, most Reformed communions do have chaplains. And so if you think about the terms of chaplaincy, it doesn't necessarily mean that the state is telling the church what to do, but it does mean the state is setting terms for a churchman's, because they're ordained, engagement with what is more or less a sort of flock. And so I think these questions have just been a lot more fraught. Doesn't mean there's one great answer, but I just don't think any of the lines are as clean as anybody might want to assume. And I think one thing I might add is I think that our understanding of the state probably hasn't changed as much as our understanding of what the church is. I work at a place and we have a variety of different faith groups on campus. Think about the way that we describe like a big evangelical church, the way they describe themselves and the way they kind of market themselves to potential parishioners. It's like, well, come here and we have community and you can get to know people, and all that stuff is good. I'm not knocking it. But in some ways, people are describing a town. They're actually describing a political association and not a spiritual one. So when you think about small groups, for example, why do you do small groups? Well, we want people to get to know each other. Okay, that's great. Is that actually the point of church? No, I thought the point of church is word and sacrament. So I think that in as much as we have, and Darryl's made this point a lot, and it's a good point, we have a big institutional breakdown in American life. A lot of the civil institutions that people used to sort of do to get to know each other, that to sort of do civic life, have collapsed. And I think that big evangelical churches are sort of trying to step up and do what's essentially a civic work, maybe without realizing it.
Interesting. And that leads to your discussion of the differences between Jefferson and Madison, sort of in a certain sense, freedom from religion versus freedom for religion, that we've had a debate about for a long time. And I love in the Federalist Papers, Madison's argument, for example, against tax exemption for churches, because the state would be making a determination of what a true church is. And he says, in fact, you quote him here, for nearly 15 centuries, what has Christendom's fruits been? More or less pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, and in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. In other words, his argument wasn't that it was bad for the state, but that it was bad for the church. Can you talk a little bit about the nuances there that we still have with us today?
Yeah. Well, that's a great, I mean, the question of churches and property is where that's coming from. These guys live downstream from the Anglican establishment in Virginia. And so Anglican churches used to have attached to them what were called glebes. Glebes, for people who've never heard that term, glebes are essentially church-owned property that aren't the church themselves. It was something that was given historically by the king to a parish so that you could make rent money off of it or grow crops or something, and that money would kind of be a little kickback to the church itself. But the church owned it. They were essentially grants from the state to the church. And in North America, there were glebes. There were glebes in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, even in New York had a few. Trinity Church on Wall Street had a glebe attached to it at one point. And so the question that Madison's getting at is an important one, because Virginia decided alone amongst the states to not allow churches to incorporate. So if you don't know this, churches couldn't incorporate in Virginia until the first decade of the 21st century. And there was a series of court cases initiated by, funny enough, Thomas Road Baptist Church, which is the big Baptist church that created Liberty University. It's Jerry Falwell's church. And so the argument was, well, hey, everyone else allows churches to incorporate. Why didn't Virginia? And the answer was, well, because they didn't want churches owning land. If a church could own its own property, it could therefore be something other than this kind of merely spiritual idea of a church. So, for example, if your church owns its own property, you've already transgressed to a considerable extent what Jefferson and Madison wanted. And so I think about this. I mean, if your church owns its own land, does that make it something other than a church? If your church obeys the local construction codes, if your church obeys the fire marshal, does that mean you're subordinating your church to the state? And so I think some of it's the way we talk about the two kingdoms as well. Is the church merely spiritual? I'm not saying it's not spiritual. I'm saying, is it only spiritual? Might be one sort of question to think about. And if your church is merely spiritual, should you own your building? Jefferson and Madison say probably not. And the state of Virginia until 2007 said no. And so these are just kind of some of the questions that they're assuming, and largely because they're living in the 18th century at a time when the church wasn't what we think of as the church. Churches were powerful, semi-political institutions. I mean, the Church of England was not a merely spiritual church. And so I don't want to knock Madison and Jefferson for sort of thinking about the legacy of church the way they do. I don't necessarily think they were the norm, though, at all, and especially on the East Coast, they weren't the norm. They were the exception.
You give some examples for your view of Christian institutionalism through legislation, the courts, the Sabbath, the treatment of Native Americans. What are some various points and anecdotes worth mentioning? What do they demonstrate to us?
So I think what they demonstrate, I use the term Christian institutionalism definitely to sort of push back against the idea of a Christian nation. And so, because I think that in a lot of ways, Christianity did make its influence felt in civic institutions, and that wasn't an inconsiderable influence. But in the early republic, there's across the board, there is a real sense that we do not want Christianity associated with the idea of an American nation. Christianity was something other than the government. And so everybody believes that. Our idea, especially in as much as people on the right sort of articulate what gets called Christian nationalism, it's an anachronism. And so you can only sort of think about Christian nationalism downstream from, actually, I think is what historically, what we might call liberal Protestant assumptions. And I'm not saying all of those liberal Protestant assumptions are heretical per se, but you can't get to Christian nationalism from specific sort of articulations of what you might call public or even state is supported Christianity in the early republic, because they do not want the state making determinations about what Christianity is. So if you might think of it this way, they're happy with the church telling them what Christianity is, but they don't want the state telling the church what Christianity is. And so in that sense, there's actually a pretty capacious place for ecclesiastical influence in the early republic. And I think people see that and they'll say, see, that's Christian nationalism. No, I think what's happening now is that we kind of want the government to do the leading on that, when historically, at least in the United States, it was churchmen, it was educational institutions, it was civic celebrations that aren't even necessarily state supported that are doing that. So it's people in the early republic is a lot of people talking to the state, and now what we tend to want to do is, I think, have actual politicians, government officers doing this. A good example is the idea of a politician doing public prayer. You would never see that in the early republic. The most theocratic New Englander, if they were a representative, member of the state house, governor, whatever, they would have never prayed in public. And now we have some cabinet officers who do it. And so that's a good example. Would some of those guys code in the early republic code as Christian nationalism because of what they think the government should do vis-a-vis Christianity? Sure. But they themselves would not have done what you might think of as churchy things, gospel presentations, praying. I think we've kind of seen, at least in the last 20 years, especially on the right, there's more a sense of, oh, we want the president to say something particularly Christian-y, or we want, whoever to say something kind of Christian-y.
It's interesting that in even more theocratic periods and places, there was that distinction, especially in churches of the Reformation. There was that strong distinction, right, between the king doing priestly duties versus the priests doing it.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that I think about, in as much as the history of Anglicanism, the monarchs don't pray in church. The priests or the bishops are still praying in church. And so I think what we've done is we've kind of, and a lot of it's the 20th century, created a very particular idea of Christianized America, instead of what I think was doing in the early 19th century, which was an Americanized Christianity, for better or worse. So America becoming its own sort of religion is, I think, a creation of the 20th century, not the 19th.
Well, let's rewind with Darryl Hart, swim across the Atlantic and talk about Protestants and patriots. You note that George III, King George, described the American Revolution as a Presbyterian rebellion. How did calls from Presbyterians around ecclesiastical issues branch out into political revolution? Feel free to start earlier here. You go all the way back to Calvin's Geneva, and maybe even a good place to start, Darryl, would be to define Erastianism.
Well, I don't know if I want to get into Erastianism yet. It's a curious thing, really, when you think about King George's remarks about Presbyterians. I think it indicates in some ways the way Presbyterianism from the 17th century was in the monarch's head, but it really is the New Englanders that are much more aggressive about asserting their rights against Parliament, raising. I just did a tour with students, Revolutionary War sites, and Concord, Lexington, Boston. These are the chief sites of the initial outbreak of the war. And these are all people, sometimes liberal Congregationalists, who are leading the charge, even some clergy preaching about tyranny and the rights of British citizens in the 1750s. Presbyterians are really kind of muted in those characteristics. Presbyterians in the 1750s, 60s, 70s, they never had an established church in North America, minus Canada, whatever was happening up there. And the Congregationalists did. They lost their charter 1692 or whatever. There's very much a New England exceptionalism that New Englanders had and that continues to shape American national history. But the real Presbyterian Revolution, I think, and I argue this in the book, is in the 1630s and 1640s, when there was such a thing as the Bishops' War, which breaks out. It's a very small war, but it is a war between the Scots and Charles I, 1639, 1640. It's sort of a forerunner to the Civil Wars and the Scots aligning with Parliament against the king in the Civil Wars of the 1640s, and a spillover. But what happened in Scotland, 1638, is the National Covenant, the affirmation of that covenant by Parliament, by the church, by the people. It is very much committed to Presbyterianism, Reformed religion, opposed to Roman Catholicism, and it's hearkening back to a covenant that James the First, but he was James VI of Scotland, had made in 1581 as part of a negative confession or King's Confession, which was also another kind of covenant that the Scottish monarchy had started. So the National Covenant for the Scots is reinstituted in 1638, and when Charles then requires the Church of Scotland to use the prayer book, that leads to the so-called Bishops' War. It was there were minor skirmishes. There were real armies formed. There were maybe a dozen lives lost, other people injured. But again, that is the trigger, or at least a catalyst, and it's very much a religious one, where people are objecting to the king imposing upon the Church of Scotland, where those religious matters spill over into the politics of England. At this point, England and Scotland are two separate realms, although ruled by one king, and that's also where this gets a little dicey in how Presbyterianism enters its way into English politics. But the 1640s lead to the Civil War. Charles is defeated. Charles is tried for treason by the Rump Parliament and executed, 1649. And the Scots, even though they were opposed to Charles, they also opposed regicide, because you don't kill the Lord's anointed. That's what you learn from the lesson of the Hebrew monarchy, David versus Saul. David had a chance to kill Saul, or his men didn't do it, because you don't kill the Lord's anointed. Plus, they had a covenant with the king, at least with the Stuart monarchy. And Charles was kind of sheepish about whether he was going to affirm that. So Presbyterianism, 1630s, 1640s, very powerful ingredient in the Civil Wars and eventually the toppling of the monarchy, which again is a huge deal in the history of the West. The French Revolution echoes that, 1790, when the French execute King Louis. But it's a big deal. There's a period of the Commonwealth era where Cromwell is the Lord Protector and beyond, and then there's the restoration of the crown in 1660. And most Presbyterians are relieved by that, because most Presbyterians in Scotland would prefer a monarchy. They're not Republican, which again makes the American Presbyterians of the 1760s and 70s very different from that, even though you could maybe have echoes of it. So to go back to your question, long-winded way of trying to answer it, I think George III has in his head, and he's not a descendant of the Stuarts, but he has in his head that Presbyterians were a pain in the neck in the 17th century, and they're up to it again, and Presbyterianism is the word he uses for that. But I think the American Revolution really does begin very much in New England.
Interesting. Talk a little bit about the American revision to the Westminster Confession of Faith regarding the magistrate.
Well, the original Westminster Confession, 1646 or 7, and it is useful to point out that this is an English document. This is Presbyterians love Scotland. They love Scottish Reformation. They think of John Knox. They think of Presbyterianism in Scotland. But Westminster Confession is not a Scottish document. There were Scottish commissioners at the Westminster Assembly, maybe 4 of them. They were giving advice, but this is very much an English document, I think, as Chad Van Dixhoorn would affirm.
Called by Parliament.
Yeah, but the language of chapter 23, I believe it is, maybe 25, I think it's 23, on the civil magistrate, really does talk about the magistrate the way that Constantine ran the Council of Nicaea. It talks about the magistrate calling synods, presiding over those synods, kind of giving counsel to those synods. You read Eusebius' accounts of Nicaea, that's what Constantine was doing. Was Eusebius always telling the truth or writing in a certain way for the good of the church? Okay, you can take it maybe with a grain of salt, but it is curious to me whenever I go back and read the original that this sounds like Nicaea. They're envisioning a magistrate, and granted, they're writing this for Parliament. They're not necessarily thinking about a king, but they're also not thinking about getting rid of monarchy altogether. So they're thinking about that relationship between magistrate and church the way Constantine was in some ways relating to the Council of Bishops at Nicaea. They do clarify he cannot administer the sacraments, lead in worship, etc., but still there's a very much a religious dimension to his civic responsibilities. And I think it evokes a kind of sacral monarchy that had been part of the Christian West going back to Constantine, but that echoes back to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew monarchs as well.
Even Luther and Calvin calling on the emperor to act as Constantine and Charlemagne of old as nursing fathers of the church to call a council.
Right. Yes, very much. The magisterial reformation did very much depend and unleash magistrates intervening or some ways mingling in the affairs of the church. And if not for that, the Reformed and Lutheran would have been the equivalent of the Anabaptists. They needed state support. So I'm not saying they did that artificially somehow, but they still needed state support.
That's a really important point, Darryl. What does that teach us too about historical context? Because sometimes we can go back and we could read the Reformers, we could read Rutherford, we can read all, and treat it as a kind of theology for every time and place and not realize that they were fighting for their lives. And the prince was their best hope, but that doesn't mean it was always consistent with their principles.
Right. I mean, I don't think it was merely pragmatic. I do think Calvin, for instance, is it book 2 or 3? I can't remember, on the magistrate, is genuine in talking about the magistrate's responsibility to promote religion, to protect the church, to enforce both tables of the law. And he does also invoke the pagan authors who also thought that the state needed to promote religion, obviously pagan religions, but he's saying this is a principle widely shared by both pagans and Christians, and today's Christian nationalists very much pick up on that. But on the other hand, if you didn't have either the Pope behind you, and the Protestants have rejected the Pope, there are 2 great authorities. There's the Pope and there's the crown, depending on where you are, which crown it is or which prince it is. And if you don't have the support of the state, you're Anabaptist, you're toast. But that also then, Luther's, where he's pleading with the German nobles to reform the church, even raise up the sword against the church, is really kind of cool and striking. And it's also kind of scary. That do you really want state going after priests and bishops that way? And yes, Luther was prone to excess at times, but that's the nature of the magisterial reform. It's only going to happen with the state backing it.
How did the American Presbyterians revise the confession on that? What led to their change of viewpoint?
Well, it's still really a mystery, and I'm thinking even in retirement when I'm going to be living a couple blocks from the Presbyterian Historical Society, God willing, seeing what they have in their archives. And I was also listening to a podcast earlier this morning. John Witherspoon, who was president of the College of New Jersey, a signer of the Declaration, the only clergyman to sign the Declaration. He was a representative of the New Jersey at the Continental Congress. He was instrumental, maybe had a big hand in the revisions, but he burned all of his private papers. But the church would still seemingly have records. But the revisions were basically backing away, that the magistrate is going to protect all the churches. I think people stop there and say this is intended only for the Protestant denominations. But there are 3 or 4 lines toward the end of that first paragraph in chapter 23 where it talks about protecting everyone from certain kinds of molestation for their beliefs and practices. And I think they could have stopped earlier if they only wanted to protect Protestants. But I think they were meeting, when they ratified it anyway, they were meeting in Philadelphia. There were Jewish congregations there, or at least one Jewish cemetery that dates before this. There was a Roman Catholic parish there. George Washington, even during the Continental Congress, when he was still a part of it, or maybe it was the Philadelphia Convention for the Constitution, worshipped at one of those Roman Catholic churches during his time there. It doesn't prove anything. It just means that Roman Catholics and Jews were part of the fabric of Philadelphia society, Philadelphia being part of the Quaker colony and unusual for having the kind of religious freedom that they had there. And the first presbytery in North America is in Philadelphia, and those ministers who met in 1706 would have been highly aware of that religious diversity. And I think they're revising it to make room for that religious diversity, and so that the magistrate, they understand that a state church, established church, and that a magistrate who's going to actively promote one religion or a state religion just isn't going to work in what's happening in the United States of America, which does exist at that point. The Constitution hasn't yet been ratified. So you could say that they're conceivably adapting this to the new reality of the United States. But I would also add that the Adopting Act of 1729, when the Synod of Philadelphia began to use the Westminster Standards as the confessional standard and began to try to require subscription, they had 2 meetings. One was they would affirm the Westminster Standards. A second meeting the same day was to allow for exceptions to that. And all of the exceptions in 1729 even were about Chapter 23 and the civil magistrate. The Presbyterians in North America didn't want that understanding of the civil magistrate that the English and the Scots had in 1646. Consequently, you could see then 1729 as a kind of preliminary to the revisions that actually took shape in 1788. But the actual debates or who called for the revisions, who initiated them, is still a mystery to me. Now, maybe there are historians out there who have nailed all this down, but I haven't seen people cite them yet.
Some recent work I've seen has and alongside yours has really explored the role that Presbyterians had at a time when they could have actually had probably a state church in New Jersey at least, but didn't, and that there was a principial move away from that. So what are we going to say is truly reformed? The Calvin's Geneva or American Presbyterianism, or again, the question of historical circumstances comes up, and you think on the Christian nationalist side, at least, they seem to want to go back behind American Presbyterianism to a more Erastian kind of Westminster Assembly in the 1640s. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think you could actually identify at least 4 strains of Presbyterians on church-state matters. And in America, 3 of those groups maybe are much less subdued. But you can have the original Covenanters, 1630s, who then after the Restoration take a beating because they're still insisting on the covenant and the monarchs don't like it and there's persecution of the Covenanters. There's a very small group, but that's one form. And eventually those Covenanters will hold on, and some will go to Ireland, some will come to North America. Then you have the Church of Scotland. Finally, we have Presbyterianism. It was always a competition between Anglican or Episcopalians and Presbyterians in Scotland, but finally settled 1690 roughly with the Glorious Revolution. And that's a very moderate church, and they're moderate because they're not going to be like the Covenanters. We got to back it down here, folks. But it's so moderate, you could argue it feels in some ways to American Presbyterians like it's the mainline church of the 20th century. It's kind of liberal, tolerant, squishy in its sentiments. But there are still conservatives in the Church of Scotland. Some of those begin to leave, 1730s. The so-called seceders or the associate reformed form their own presbytery. They will also eventually go to Ireland and North America as well. And then in the 19th century, skipping way ahead, you have the Free Church that also says this state church business isn't working. We're going to get out. We're still committed to an ecclesiastical establishment, and we're going to try to function as if we're the state church. But in effect, they really have to function as a denomination, as a free church, as a voluntary church. And all of those 3 groups, they do show up in the United States. Free Church, much less so. But Free Church, Associate Reformed, the Covenanters, and the Church of Scotland are all part of the original Presbyterianism in Canada. And they're trying to sort that out with Anglicans and Methodists. It's a really fascinating history. I think Americans don't take Canada as seriously as we should. This isn't necessarily pro-Canada, but it's still a fascinating part of the way that British Protestantism moved to the New World, and it's a different kind of New World than the United States. But the way that they eventually had to sort out, Miles earlier was talking about these glebe lands. Well, they had similar arrangements so that Anglicans and Presbyterians in Scotland would receive support, some kind of encouragement from the state because, oh, by the way, both the Church of Scotland and Church of England are the established churches in the United Kingdom. And so we got to recognize those in Canada. But wait a minute, then there are all these other Presbyterian groups. So eventually, the political arrangements bring the Canadian Presbyterians together so that by 1867 and then 1875, you have the Presbyterian Church of Canada form these different streams together. But it takes almost 70 years for that to happen, which is roughly the same time as well as the formation of the Confederation of Canada, basically the origins of Canada, not as a separate nation. It's still in the Commonwealth. It's a dominion, but it's still kind of Canada beginning to operate on its own in ways within the British Empire that Ireland had tried earlier and America might have tried. Anyway, it's a very fascinating way of looking at Reformed churches in another part of the world, up in Canada, which is not very far.
In what ways are early American, that is U.S. Presbyterians, similar to or different from today's post-liberal movements or proponents of Christian nationalism?
Well, I guess one way to answer that, and this is building off what I was listening to earlier, a very interesting, lively interview about John Witherspoon by Jeff Morrison, who wrote a book on Witherspoon almost 20 years ago, but was being interviewed about that again in connection with the 250th and Witherspoon's role in the Continental Congress. One thing you could argue is that today's proponents of a Christian America, which I think we also need to keep in mind it's been going on for at least 40 years. When you think back to the Moral Majority and Francis Schaeffer and Jerry Falwell, they were also arguing for a kind of recovery of America's Christian roots. And you have a similar expression of that today, although I think it's very different. But where Witherspoon and Madison following him, Madison was a student of Witherspoon, and most of the founders believed that for a republic to truly function, you needed a virtuous people. And the way that you would get virtue was from the church or from the churches. And so in that way, for the state to encourage the churches, they were then therefore encouraging good citizenship among the people. But what this professor was also saying, Morrison, was that Madison and Witherspoon both, and this fits with the revision of the Westminster Confession, they didn't want the state to do anything religious. The way Miles was saying earlier, that you wouldn't have a magistrate praying. They wanted to let the churches do it, encourage the churches to do this work, and the state is going to remain apart from it. And what we hear today is proposals for making the government Christian, making the prince or the magistrate a Christian, who will then promote Christianity as part of the public good. And I think at the time of the founding, and for Presbyterians at the time of the American Revolution, they had had enough of the state promoting Christianity in that way. Let's try a different arrangement. We're going to have a small government with limited operations. The Constitution enumerates what those powers are of the federal government. And now let's let the churches do all that they want to do and create all sorts of Christians and let virtue kind of come from the bottom up rather than the top down.
So when we look out at the situation today, it seems like, both a kind of secularist nationalism on one side, Christian nationalism reacting against it, that there's this hollowing out, actually, of the church in the name of a kind of nationalism. The nation becomes sacred. And who are the ministers of the nation? The senators, the princes, the magistrates. And we have to have them affirming our Christian nation. Does that seem like what's happening right now?
It does. And I can't figure out the degree to which it's part of a 2 or 3.0 of theonomy, which was trying to recover the Old Testament laws in some ways for the modern state, or
which would represent Doug Wilson today.
Yeah. Or if it's kind of civil religion, which has a very long history in the United States, which does turn the United States into a kind of sacred enterprise. Mm-hmm. I was reading a book review this week of a new collection of John Quincy Adams' speeches, and one of his long speeches was roughly from 1819, defending the Declaration and the Constitution, but talking about the eternal and sacred dimensions of the Declaration. And I think that evokes an older strain of New England and Presbyterian theology, covenant theology, and a covenanted nation. Covenanters were doing that in Scotland as well. But that the United States was in a kind of covenanted relationship with God, but then you turn that into a kind of American exceptionalism, and then you can get the idea that America alone has this covenanted relationship with God. And I do think that is part of the source of turning America into a Redeemer nation, which is a long theme in American politics throughout American history. And for my money, as someone who's a spirituality of the church person and a amillennial person, it doesn't work well with me, but it's clearly there, and I'm still trying to figure out where those sources, how they're being used today by so-called proponents of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, because as your colleague Richard Gamble has argued so well, documented so well, it was actually mainline progressive Protestants who pioneered the idea of America as a Redeemer nation, a Christian nation, of course with earlier precedents, but that really that all the way up to Woodrow Wilson, this idea of America having this sacred mantle laid upon it for the redemption of the world.
Right.
But now it's sort of coming from the right,
yes,
rather than the left.
It's very odd. And I would add, too, sometimes I think, language of vocabulary, and Mike, you've written a lot about the importance of language in theology. But it does matter. You have certain terms, categories available for thinking about society or politics. And in America, we have a long tradition of using Christian terms to think about this. But, if you read other sources from the West, especially pagan sources, whether Roman or Greek, you do have other sources for thinking about a republic or a democracy, and, different kinds of government, different kinds of constitutions. But if you believe in the Bible and the importance of the Bible as your sole authority, if the Bible gave you some directions about democracy or republics or something, not to be too literal, okay, then that may be a point. But there's so many different authors from the ancient and modern worlds that you could use to talk about good government. And as some Christian nationalists do that, I think in particular, I don't want to necessarily name names, but to give an illustration, Stephen Wolfe does that in his book. He's trained as a political theorist, or maybe he prefers political philosopher. Those people get upset with the terms philosophy or theory, but he does do a lot of retrieval of older sources about political theory in his work, and he's much more conversant with those non-Christian sources as well. But still, the outcome is to put it in Christian categories.
Well, Darryl, my good friend, it's great to talk to you again, even if it's behind a screen. And I wish you well. Thank you so much for all of your contributions, and especially this latest work of yours, Protestants and Patriots, Presbyterians in the Age of Revolution, published by Notre Dame Press. And it's been great to talk about this, especially as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of this great nation of ours.